Hello everyone, this is Lala and I've been thinking about the isms, which are Colorism, Featurism, and Texturism. These three isms are always discussed when it comes to marginalized racial and ethnic communities, especially regarding to black people, and I thought about whether these isms existed amongst white people. Usually people wouldn't think so, since they are a privileged racial group, but when I looked into it, the isms definitely do exist. Before I actually delve into this, I want to acknowledge that nothing that white people deal with in regards to their racial group is anything like marginalized racial groups, especially when it comes to the isms, and they still benefit from the racial hierarchy that society is insistent on sticking with overall, especially through a Western Eurocentric point of view. At the same time, I've noticed that within other racial and even ethnic groups, whether you benefit from or are the recipient of the isms, everyone still acknowledges that you are a part of that racial group or identity. With white people, they will label you as non-white if you are the recipient of some of these isms, and they will outright claim that you are not white, despite having West Eurasian DNA and having the phenotype associated with white people. So I think that's the difference between the isms within white people and the isms outside of the white community and within other marginalized minority groups. With that in mind, I have to go through the three categories of the isms first. The most well-known ism is colorism, which is the prejudice or discrimination against individuals with a dark skin tone, typically among people of the same racial group. With black people and Asian people, everyone knows that it's about light-skinned people in those are beneficiaries, and darker-skinned people in those groups are the recipients of it. The term white in itself suggests light, but as we know, there are several shades of skin tones that people of each racial group has, and that's acknowledged with black people and Asian people, as well as mixed race people. With white people, there are several different skin tones, and based on where you or they are in those skin tones regarding white people, it does create a hierarchy amongst that race, where lighter people are seen as more white and more pure, and the more quote-unquote tan people, since being dark and white are oxymorons, have their racial status debated, seen as more ambiguous, or are outright kicked out of the community, or may be seen as quote-unquote unpure or quote-unquote diluted, which is why stuff like the one-drop rule, where essentially white people who had a drop of black in them were considered black. So that kind of plays into this as well. So, there is a scale called the Fitzpatrick Skin Type Scale that gives a range of skin colors from the lightest to darkest, with Type 1 representing the lightest and Type 6 representing the darkest. I'm going to go over the skin types that white people or Caucasian people, whatever term that you prefer to use, fall into, and we will delve into the nuances of that. Type 1 is what I generally call very pale/freckled, which is pretty self-explanatory. These are people that are extremely pale, they cannot tan at all, they have freckles, and do not handle the sun well at all. Their skin is the closest to being the literal color of white. Many of them do have freckles, and it's easy for them to get red spots, and they're extremely melanin deficient, even compared to other white or Caucasian people. This skin tone is extremely rare, which is why it's also so coveted, though it is mainly heralded by people of Northern European descent, and some from Eastern and Western Europe as well. Generally, all of the natural redheads fit into the skin type. Type 2 is what is generally known as fair/pale with beige, which is still very light and fair-skinned overall, but there's a slight undertone of yellow or beige, and there isn't the rosiness of the first type skin tone in comparison. Despite that, it is still very hard for people in the skin tone to tan, and while it is not impossible, it is difficult, and getting a tan without sunburning is not very likely, and a lot of work will need to be done. It is also the most common skin type amongst white people, and is found all over Europe, the Middle East, and even some areas in North Africa, and of course amongst some Hispanic people in Latin America. Type 3 is generally seen as beige or light olive, which is probably the second most common skin tone amongst white people. Of course, there's a lot of light brown undertones, and some olive beigeness that adds some slight color to the skin, which proves a decent enough melanin that suits them for a tan. It is still found in some northwestern Europeans, but it's more common amongst Eastern, Central, and Southern Europeans, as well as some Middle Eastern, North Africans, and Latin Americans. I do feel like this skin tone can fluctuate the most depending on the season, especially compared to the other three skin tones that I'm going to be discussing, which is why some of them have a nice light brown tan in the summer and are lighter in the colder months and seasons. I noticed that with this skin type, if you are the recipient of Featurism or Texturism, you might be seen as more ambiguous depending on your phenotype. Type 4 is generally called olive to light / medium brown, which is where things start getting muddy for some white people. These are people who very easily tan, have minimal issues with sunburns, and they stand out a lot compared to the other three types, since they are not pale people under any circumstance. A lot of people who aren't white also have the skin tone, so it is a slippery slope under the eyes of some white people. It is more commonly found in Mediterranean areas, so Southern Europe, and most commonly in the Middle East, North Africa, and amongst a lot of Hispanic people in Latin America as well. With this skin tone, some people will not see them as white, or their whiteness will be debated for sure, even if they do benefit from texturism and featurism, but it will be worse if they are the recipient of it. Also, a lot of biracial with white people tend to fall under this category as well. I guess I'm going to talk about featurism next, which is the preference for Eurocentric features, and the discrimination of features that aren't Eurocentric, so Afrocentric or Asiacentric features. You would think that everyone who has majority European or West Eurasian DNA would have Eurocentric features, and for a lot of them, they do have Eurocentric features. But first, we have to go over what are Eurocentric features, and on average, it is people who have big bold eyes that aren't slanted or have prominent eyelids. They do have prominent eyelids, thinner lips, a thinner nose, with smaller nostrils. Blue and green eyes are preferred, though most of them don't have this, as most people, regardless of race, have brown eyes. But it gives them a bonus, light skin and high cheekbones, and a defined jaw. All of this is by average, and we know a lot of people, no matter what race, have many different looks. Eurocentric features is a result of Eurocentrism, which means that anything tied to being European or Caucasian is better than anything that isn't such, and is inferior. Some people who are claimed to be white might have things like a broader nose, thinner eyelids, thicker lips, thin eyes in general, darker skin, or some other feature that does not line up with the Eurocentricity regarding their facial features, and it will cause them to be seen as either ambiguous or outright not white. When you include people who are mixed with white, so multiracial and biracial people, their non-Eurocentric features automatically kick them out of whiteness and onto whatever other race they fit into. And the final ism is texturism, which is defined as the idea that certain textures of hair are an indicator of a superior status in society. Obviously, this mainly refers to black people, or people of black descent, and I guess technically it could refer to some people who fit the Mongoloid or Asian races, depending on how you look at Pacific Islanders, but that's besides the point. But on average, black people are the only ones who really have type 4 hair, unless you're counting Pacific Islanders for Asian. But looking at it in the context of white people or Caucasoid people, who can have the variety of the other three hair types, it definitely gets messy but very interesting. Overall, texturism is the preference for straighter hair over other types of hair, but we need to go over the types of hair, especially ones that fit white people or Caucasian people. Type 1 hair is in reference to hair that is extremely straight to the bone, where it lacks any curve or wave pattern in their hair, with it also having a sleek and shiny appearance to it. There are three subcategories for each hair type, and with type 1 hair it is 1/8, which is straight, wispy, does not hold curls at all, and is the rarest type of hair form in type 1. 1B, which is still straight but has more body on it compared to 1A, and 1C, which is still straight but has a decent amount of body and has the capability to form some sort of bend. It is easy for natural oils to go through the hair because of the straight pattern, adding that shine, but it can also cause greasy hair and a lack of volume. Type 2 hair is in reference to wavy hair, but it's kind of seen as an in-between since it's isn't straight hair a la type 1, and it isn't curly hair a la type 3. So the variation with this type is probably the largest out of the three I will discuss. Regarding the subcategories, 2A is pretty close to type 1 as it's still thin, straight, and somewhat shiny, but there's a slightly long S pattern with the hair. 2B is where the hair is getting somewhat thick and the S pattern is tighter compared to 2A, and the hair is becoming a bit harder to manage. And 2C is where the S's are very tight and prominent, with the hair getting coarse and is harder to manage in comparison, but isn't too oily or dry. The final hair type that I'm discussing here is type 3 hair, which is in reference to curly hair and is generally hard to manage since the curls are prominent and the hair overall has a lot of volume. Regarding the subcategories, 3A is prominent but loosely patterned hair with the S's and has a bit less volume and flatness compared to the others of this category. It's easy to confuse this with 2C, I've noticed. 3B has a lot more volume, the S pattern is very tight, and the hair is a lot more voluminous. And finally, 3C is where the hair is starting to get coarse, the curls are very tight and closely dense, and it is very similar to type 4 hair, which in general is coily and kinky. It is easier to have drier hair with this type in comparison to the other two. Now that I went into detail about colorism, featurism, and texturism, I'm going to discuss the order in how I feel white people see as the most important, or which one of the isms is the strongest when it comes to which ones they prioritize, and to the least pertaining how they gatekeep whiteness and to create their hierarchy. Like I said earlier on in the video, the three isms, in my opinion, function in a different way than it does with the black community and even the Asian community, or just ethnic minorities in general, since the white community is still the most privileged on average. Just from my observations, it seems like featurism is the biggest issue, and is the ism that white people take the most seriously and use the most to gatekeep, and I think that is the case for a few reasons. One of those reasons is that there's a huge thing about color scheme, especially when it comes to eye color and hair color. By now, we all know about the blonde hair and blue-eyed ideology being seen and portrayed as the beacon of white beauty standards to the point where it has become a trope. Generally, the lighter eye color and hair color you have, the more treasured you are, since it is so rare, and not that brown eyes and dark hair is stigmatized, but it's just very normalized in comparison, so it isn't seen as special. The sharper bone structure is also something that is cherished in the white community on average, in addition to high cheekbones, large eyes with prominent eyelids, slim noses that button up at the end and with thin nostrils, and smaller lips in fullness, with a mouth that isn't wide in width. Depending on how your phenotype adds up, and if you have non-Eurocentric features, people will consider you racially ambiguous even if you are white, and they might not consider you to be non-white, especially if you're also the recipient of one of the other two isms. Just from what I have seen, people notice and point out facial features to distinguish non-whiteness, even amongst people who fit under the quote-unquote Caucasoid group first. With the other two, you might be able to get away with fitting into whiteness, but featurism tends to trump everything else in the first, which you especially see with biracial people who are mixed with white, and it's usually the first thing that they refer to when they dismiss biracial people from being white. The next strongest ism when it comes to white people, in my opinion, is colorism, and it definitely makes sense, since white is essentially the lightest color or shade that there is, so you would expect someone who is white to be light, or anyone who is a white person or a part of the white race. So I went over the 6 skin shades on average. Actually, no, I didn't address the last two because white people don't have that. And obviously, white people would have the lighter skin shades, so presumably the first 3 shades, though there are some that has the 4th shade. Someone with a type 3 skin tone, by example, tends to tan really well, and they have a browner undertone to them, but there are people who are legally classified as quote-unquote white or are part of the Caucasian race, and they are essentially people with a brown skin tone, tans in their sleep, don't have any light undertones, and stand out a lot compared to people of the other skin tones. And some of these people fit under type 4 as well. On average, there are some white Latinos, Middle Eastern and North African people, and even some Southern European people, mainly the islanders, who have the darkest skin tones, and if they either have very coarse or curly hair and or features that might not be seen as Eurocentric or aren't high on the hierarchy, they will have their whiteness debated. So, for an example, a white person having a broad nose that is akin to a black person, a white person having a flatter nose akin to an Asian person, eyes akin to Asian people, lips akin to black people, etc., etc. So, stuff like that. And the third ism, which I think is the least important pertaining to the white community, is texturism. I say this because a lot of white people tend to have types of all three hair types that I discussed, so it's not just Southern Europeans, Middle Eastern North African people, or Hispanics having type 3 hair, though it is more common amongst them, and it's not just Northwestern Europeans only having type 1 hair, though there are commonality patterns. Just because I think this is the weakest ism when it comes to determining slash gatekeeping whiteness, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And I think the perception is given because a lot of people don't realize how many white people straighten, gel, and perm their hair. Even just looking at all the celebrities, and I'm looking at before and after pictures, a lot of them came into the game with very curly hair, or you see them in their natural state, whether they're at home, they're not promoting anything, they have curly hair. But whenever they're out, they have so much gel in their hair, they straighten their hair. So it's clear that on average, white people, even a lot of the ones who have naturally curly type 3 hair, they prefer the type 1 or the high type 2 hair type since they changed their hair to look like that, so they put those type of hair types on a pedestal. We all know that the stigma is only given to black people and other communities of color, and while it is stronger there, it definitely exists here. It's actually shocking seeing the amount of celebrities that walk around with curly hair naturally, as I mentioned. Even so many of these white celebrities who are known for their straight hair have curly hair, and I noticed that it's easy to go from curly to straight no matter what race, but it isn't easy to go from straight to curly, especially if you have naturally straight hair, and even when they go curly, it generally doesn't have a natural look to it. We all know the perception of curly hair is that it is unruly, unorganized, dirty, messy, and untamable, so on and so forth. So many straighten their hair to have that shiny, professional look. And when it comes to reality TV, they give hairstyles to a lot of their contestants. So if someone approaches on their show with curly hair, they're doing that to give them a stereotype right off the job, or so they can have the appearance of someone who is either laid back, doesn't care about, or is just lackadaisical, or overall messy. So there is a virtue signal there. So there's a thread on Twitter about a week or two ago about ethnically ambiguous white people, and it's interesting that who were on it. Joseph Gordon-Levitt is Ashkenazi Jewish, and people on the thread were saying that they thought he was part Asian or part Indigenous American, where I'm assuming that they thought this due to his eyelids. Mickey Madison was also on the list for the same reason, technically, and she's also Jewish, where it's clear that people thought she was part Asian due to her eyes and facial structure. Ezra Miller is also Jewish, as well as Dutch and German, where a bunch of people also thought that he was of Asian descent as well, for the same reasons. Taylor Lautner was of course mentioned, as his most popular role involved him playing a Native American man, or a Native American werewolf, technically, though in reality Taylor is just a white man. This is why I believe that Featurism is the biggest ism compared to or relating to white people compared to the other two isms, because one feature that isn't Eurocentric, despite having the lineage and other features that lined up, causes them to be seen as racially ambiguous and people questioning their whiteness. And these are from non-mixed people. So imagining people who are mixed with white, who either has a nose that is or lips that are akin to black features, or they have other features that indicate Asian features. So it's kind of why a lot of biracial with white people are automatically lumped in with their other half in general. When you are a white person or someone who fits in the diaspora and you suffer from two or all three of the isms, people will claim that you are not white or you just come off as extremely ambiguous, even if the lineage and DNA tends to match what is considered white or Caucasian. Whiteness and being quote unquote Caucasian in general is all about exclusivity
and gatekeeping like no other. So if someone does not fit the rigid European standards, which encourages hegemony and quote unquote purity, which in itself is just a joke, instead as a diversity in phenotypes, cultures, and looks that people in the race has, they will be outcasted, and it causes a lot of confusion, especially with the ideology of a person of color, though someone's legal identification may suggest otherwise and claim them as white. Anyways, I might make this into a little series and delve into the isms a bit more and connect it to reality TV or other media a bit more than I did here. Thank you all for watching, and I'll be back soon. Take care.